Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we uncover heartfelt tales of love, redemption, and the resilience of the human spirit. Today's story takes us into the life of a millionaire who makes an unforgivable mistake, only to find himself grappling with regret and the power of second chances 4 years later. Let's dive in. It was a late summer evening when I saw him for the first time. I was just a kid, no older than 15. Walking home from school when I saw a group of men at the corner of my street. They were laughing, drinking, and yelling at each other like a regular Friday night. Except for one thing, one of those men was different. He was black, and I knew instantly that he didn't belong. That sounds awful, doesn't it? But let me tell you, back then, that was the reality. In the town of Rockford, you didn't see many black people. That's just how it was. And when you did, you couldn't help but feel that they were out of place. I don't know if I was born with this thinking, or if it was something that had been drilled into me. But as a kid, you don't question it. You just live it. You don't even see the injustice until it slaps you in the face. And let me tell you, it wasn't until I saw that man, the one who was walking so proudly, so confidently, so damn unafraid, when I realized how wrong everything was. His name was Ray. I didn't know that back then. Hell, I didn't even know if he knew my name. But I remember how his eyes didn't shift when the men started calling him names. How his shoulders stayed straight, his head held high. They made fun of him, laughed about how he thought he could just walk through their neighborhood like it was his own. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like everything inside me snapped. I had been raised to believe that black people didn't belong here. I had been taught that they were nothing more than trouble, just trouble waiting to happen. And in Rockford, that was the truth. You knew that you didn't talk to them, didn't look at them, didn't engage. It was just easier that way. You didn't ask questions. You didn't step outside of the lines. The town had a system, and that system worked. But here was Ray, standing tall in the face of everything that had been built against him. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't running away. And for the first time in my life, I questioned everything. I didn't know it then. But that moment would be the one that changed everything. You see, my family wasn't like the others. They didn't hate. They didn't throw stones at black people. They didn't openly disgrace them. But they didn't stand up either. And that silence, that lack of action, it was a different kind of violence. A silent agreement that what was happening, what we were doing, was okay. I saw Ray again the next day. And the day after that. The more I saw him, the more I started to notice how people treated him, how they looked at him when they thought no one was watching, how they crossed the street when he walked by, how the kids at school would make jokes and talk about him like he wasn't even human. But Ray never flinched. He didn't smile at them, but he didn't back down either. It made me sick to my stomach, but I didn't know how to stop it. I was just a kid. What could I do? I had no power, no voice, no platform to make any kind of difference. But it didn't matter. Because one thing became crystal clear. There was no turning back. I knew that I could no longer be part of the system that kept people like Ray down. I knew that if I didn't do something, I was just as guilty as the ones who threw the stones. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A few weeks after I first saw Ray, my older brother, Jake, came home furious. He was 17, already in high school, and starting to get involved in his own little rebellious acts. He was a good guy, but he had a temper, and it was no surprise when he came storming through the door, telling our parents that he had gotten into a fight at school. "What happened?" my mom asked, standing up in the kitchen, her voice full of concern. "It was Ray," Jake said, barely able to contain his rage. "Some guys were picking on him in the cafeteria. So, I stepped in. I wasn't going to let them treat him like that." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My brother, Jake, the one who always played by the rules, the one who did what everyone expected of him, had stood up for Ray, and it felt like the world had shifted just a little bit. For the first time in my life, I wasn't ashamed of my brother. I was proud of him, but I also knew that this wasn't going to end well. You don't go up against the system and just walk away unscathed. And I feared for Jake, because standing up for Ray was going to cost him. It was going to cost him more than he knew. And as much as I wanted to do the same, I was scared. Jake didn't care. He didn't care about the consequences. He didn't care about what our friends, our neighbors, or anyone else thought. All he cared about was that Ray was being mistreated. And that was enough for him. As I sat there listening to my brother, something changed inside me. I knew I couldn't just stand by and watch anymore. It was time to act, time to stand up. Because sometimes, doing nothing makes you complicit in the wrong. And if you want change, you've got to be willing to be a part of it. That's how it started. That's how I went from being a bystander to someone who could see the injustice for what it was. And that's when I realized that I couldn't just be mad. I couldn't just be angry and do nothing. I had to fight, not with my fists, not with words of hate, but with something bigger, something that would make them listen. And just like that, everything changed. The weeks after Jake's fight were a whirlwind. Every time I thought about what had happened, I felt a tightness in my chest. It wasn't just because my brother had fought for someone who wasn't supposed to belong, but because the fight was bigger than I had realized. It wasn't just about one moment in the cafeteria or one kid standing up against bullies. It was about everything that had led to this point, everything that had made this town feel so divided. I remember that night like it was yesterday. Jake came home late after the fight at school, his knuckles bruised, his lips swollen. Mom didn't say anything at first. She just handed him a glass of water, her face full of worry. Dad, on the other hand, was furious. I could hear their voices rising in the living room, each word cutting through the house like a blade. You can't go around picking fights. Jake, you got to be smart about this. Dad shouted, his fists clenching in frustration. It wasn't about a fight, Dad. It was about doing what was right. Jake shot back, his voice steady despite the tension. I had never heard him speak like that before. I knew he believed it, but I also knew how dangerous it was. Standing up to the system in this town wasn't just brave, it was reckless. In a place like Rockford, where things like racism were quietly accepted, standing up meant you were going against everything that everyone else thought was normal. But Jake wasn't scared, and that was something I couldn't wrap my mind around. He was a kid just like me. And yet, in that moment, he was more of a man than I had ever been. It was like he had this conviction, this fire that I couldn't understand, and it made me question everything I thought I knew. For me, though, it wasn't that easy. I didn't want to be the person who stood out. I didn't want to risk everything. Not like Jake. I still had my friends, my place in this world, and if I made the wrong move, I could lose it all. But as the days went on, I started seeing things differently. I noticed how people stared at Ray when he passed by, how their eyes darted away quickly as if they were ashamed of the things they were thinking. I saw the way people made excuses for their actions, as if it wasn't a big deal, as if it was just part of life. The truth hit me harder than I expected. We weren't just living in a town full of prejudice. We were part of it. Every quiet moment of ignoring what was happening around us, every decision not to speak up, it was all part of the problem. And that's when I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Jake's actions had sparked something inside me, something I couldn't ignore. I wasn't sure what it was yet, but it felt like a storm was building. At school, it was hard to even walk down the hall without hearing whispers about Jake's fight. Some students respected him for standing up for Ray. Others looked at him like he had betrayed them, like he had broken some unspoken rule. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the way I started seeing the world differently. Jake's fight wasn't just a fight. It was a signal, a sign that things had to change. One afternoon, as I was walking home from school, I saw Ray again. This time, he wasn't just walking past. He was standing at the corner of my street, talking to a few other guys who seemed to be looking out for him. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if I should approach him, but then I realized I had to. I walked over to him slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. When he saw me, he didn't flinch, didn't look uncomfortable. Instead, he smiled at me a real smile. "You're Jake's brother, right?" he asked, his voice calm, but with a knowing undertone. "Yeah," I replied, unsure of what to say next. I wanted to thank you for standing up." Ray looked at me, his eyes intense but kind. "I didn't stand up for you. I stood up for what's right. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" His words hit me like a brick. What was I going to do? I had been asking myself that question for days, weeks even, and yet, the answer had been right in front of me the whole time. I couldn't sit back anymore. I couldn't just watch and hope things would change. If I was going to do something, it had to start now. I'm not sure yet. I admit it, feeling a mix of fear and resolve. But I'm going to try. Ray nodded slowly. That's all any of us can do. Man, try. Just remember, when you start standing up for what's right, there's no going back. The world's not going to make it easy for you. That was the day it all started to make sense. The truth is, Ray wasn't asking for a fight. He wasn't asking for anyone's pity. All he wanted was respect. All he wanted was the same dignity we all took for granted. And that was the one thing I could give him. But it wasn't just Ray who needed respect. It was everyone in this town who had been silenced, who had been pushed aside. It was all the kids who lived in fear of being who they were. It was the families who never got the chance to speak up because the world wouldn't listen. Standing up wasn't going to be easy. But in that moment, I knew that I had no choice but to do it. And if I was going to stand up, I had to do it for everyone, for Ray, for Jake, for myself, and for every person who had been told that they didn't belong. This was just the beginning, but it was the beginning of something important, something I couldn't ignore, something that would change everything. As the days went by, things at school got even harder. I could feel the tension in the air every time I stepped into the hallway. Jake's fight had sent ripples through the entire school. And it wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about what it stood for, about what Jake had dared to challenge. He hadn't just stood up for Ray. He had stood up against years of hate and prejudice that had been allowed to fester quietly in the shadows. Now, those shadows were coming to light, and no one was prepared for it. I was in class one afternoon when I overheard a conversation between two guys from the football team. They were talking about Jake, calling him a traitor, mocking the idea of standing up for those people. I wanted to say something, but the words caught in my throat. I wanted to tell them that Jake had done something right, that it was about more than just one person. It was about the future of everyone who had been pushed down or overlooked. But I couldn't. Not yet. Then, I saw Ray in the hallway after school. He wasn't alone this time. He had a couple of his friends with him, and they were laughing, joking around like it was just another normal day. It was strange to see him so carefree. I'd only seen Ray when he was serious or when he was getting picked on, but now he seemed different. He seemed like he was starting to feel free. Free from the weight of everything that had been put on him for no reason other than the color of his skin. I walked up to him, still not sure what I was going to say, but before I could speak, Ray turned and grinned at me. "You're Jake's brother, right?" he asked, his tone warm. I've been meaning to thank him properly. I nodded, unsure of what to say. He's just doing what he thinks is right." Ray's smile softened. "That's what makes him different. You know, he's got guts." He paused, looking at me more seriously. "And it's because of people like him that I can walk down these halls without feeling like I'm invisible." I felt a lump form in my throat. The weight of Ray's words hit harder than I expected. What he said wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. About everyone who had ever been ignored or treated like less than human. "I think we need more people like him," I said quietly, finally finding my voice. Ray looked at me with a sense of understanding, his eyes sharp but kind. "More people like him? Nah. What we need is more people like you. People who are willing to speak up, even when it's uncomfortable." I froze. The idea of speaking up had terrified me for so long. I'd always thought that if I just kept my head down, if I just stayed out of the way, things would be okay. But it wasn't okay. Things were never going to be okay until someone stepped forward and made it clear that what was happening wasn't acceptable. And maybe that someone could be me. The next day, I woke up with a fire in my chest. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew that I couldn't stay silent anymore. I wasn't sure if I had what it took, but I knew I had to try. I couldn't just watch the world go on like this, pretending everything was fine when people were being hurt, when things were being swept under the rug. I spent the entire day trying to come up with a plan. How could I speak out without putting myself in danger? How could I stand up and make sure people heard me without risking everything I had? I didn't want to lose my friends. I didn't want to face the judgment of everyone around me. But I knew that my silence made me complicit. My silence allowed all of this to keep happening. And I couldn't do that anymore. That afternoon, I found myself walking down the hallway to the principal's office. I didn't know why I was going there, but it felt like the right place. Maybe I could talk to him about what was going on. Maybe I could do something to make a change. But as I approached his office, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, sitting in the hallway with his back against the wall, was Ray. He looked up at me as I stood frozen in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" I asked, confused. "I'm just waiting for the inevitable," Ray said with a slight smile. "But I think it's time you joined the fight too." His words hung in the air like a challenge. It wasn't about being scared anymore. It was about whether I was willing to be part of the change. It wasn't about what I was afraid of losing, but what I was willing to stand up for. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Yeah, I think it's time," I said, my voice shaking but filled with something I hadn't felt in a long time: resolve. Ray smiled, and for the first time, it felt like we were on the same side. The fight wasn't just about Jake or Ray anymore. It was about all of us, about standing up for what was right and making sure that no one had to fight alone. And I wasn't going to let that happen. I was going to be part of something bigger, something that would make a difference for the future, even if it meant facing my fears head on. Because the truth was, I couldn't live in a world where doing nothing was acceptable. Not anymore. I walked into the principal's office, knowing that this was only the beginning. But it was the beginning of something powerful, something that could change everything. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. After that conversation with Ray, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was changing. I had made the decision to speak up, but I had no idea where to begin. The weight of my choice was both terrifying and exhilarating. I kept replaying the conversation with Ray over and over in my head, his words echoing in my mind. "We need more people like you." I knew he was right, but how was I supposed to make a difference? I wasn't a leader. I wasn't a public figure. I was just me, someone who had always kept his head down and stayed out of the way. But staying out of the way wasn't an option anymore. I had to do something, even if it was small, because in the grand scheme of things, maybe the smallest actions could cause the biggest ripple. I spent that night writing down my thoughts, trying to organize what I wanted to say, who I needed to talk to, and what steps I had to take. I wasn't sure if anyone would listen, but I couldn't just sit back anymore. I couldn't ignore what was happening at school. The hate, the division, and the cruelty had to be stopped, and maybe I could be part of that change. The next day, I met with Jake after school. He was sitting on the bleachers, his feet hanging off the edge, staring out at the empty field. His eyes were distant, like he was still processing everything that had happened. I could tell that he was still wrestling with the aftermath of his actions. But I knew that deep down, he was proud of what he had done. And for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes, a hope that maybe this fight wasn't in vain. "Jake," I said, sitting beside him. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging my presence. "You've got guts. You know that," I told him, the words coming out before I even realized it. "What you did, standing up for Ray, it was the right thing." Jake let out a small, dry laugh. "I didn't do it for applause. I did it because it's what should have happened a long time ago." "I know, but it's not over yet," I said, my voice growing more determined. "I can't just sit here and watch it continue. I want to do something." Jake looked at me now, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. "Like what?" "I don't know," I admitted, feeling vulnerable. "But I'm starting to think that maybe we need to confront the system, the way things have always been. I don't think this is just about us or Ray. This is bigger. We have to do something that makes people listen." Jake was quiet for a moment, clearly processing what I had said. "You're serious, aren't you?" I nodded, feeling a wave of confidence wash over me. "Yeah, I'm serious." The following week, I started talking to people, anyone who would listen. I spoke with some teachers, with students I knew felt the same way but had been too afraid to speak up. And slowly, the conversations began to grow. It wasn't just about Ray or Jake anymore. It was about all of us, about standing up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. I went to the school administration, nervously explaining everything that had been happening. I told them about the bullying, about the racial tensions, and about how we couldn't just ignore it any longer. I was nervous, but when I saw the look of surprise in their eyes, I realized something. No one had ever come to them with these concerns. It had always been brushed under the rug. You're asking us to do what exactly? The principal asked, his voice skeptical. I'm asking for a platform, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. A space where we can have real conversations about race, about injustice, about the things we're all too afraid to talk about. The principal looked at me for a long moment, like he was weighing my words. Finally, he spoke. We could set up a meeting, but it's not going to be easy. You'll be facing opposition. A lot of people won't like this. I know, I said, but we can't stay silent anymore. Not if we want things to change. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and I could already feel the tension building. Word had gotten out that a student was pushing for a discussion about race and injustice, and I could already hear the murmurs in the hallway. Some people were supportive, but others, well, they weren't so eager to have the conversation. When the day of the meeting arrived, I stood in front of a room filled with students, teachers, and administrators. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I was determined. Jake stood beside me, his presence a reminder that we weren't in this alone. We had each other, and we had the people who believed in what we were trying to do. I took a deep breath and began to speak. We can't keep pretending that everything is okay. We can't ignore the hate that's been allowed to grow here. If we don't do something about it now, it will only get worse. This isn't just about one fight. It's about all of us, about making sure that no one has to feel less than because of where they come from or the color of their skin. I paused, letting the words sink in. We have to make a change, and it starts with all of us. But we need a place where we can talk openly, without fear, a place where everyone is heard, no matter who they are or where they come from. The room was silent, but I could feel the weight of the moment. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was alone. I felt like we were all in this together. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step in making things right. The weeks following that meeting felt like a blur. It wasn't easy. Change never is. We had our supporters, but there were just as many who were angry, who didn't want to confront the uncomfortable truths we were starting to bring to light. But the more we talked, the more we realized that we weren't backing down. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a movement, and it was gaining momentum. Jake and I were in it together, but we knew this was bigger than just the two of us. Slowly, more students came forward, sharing their own experiences, their struggles. It felt like the walls that had been built up over years of silence were finally beginning to crack. But there were consequences. Some of the teachers, the ones who had always turned a blind eye to the racial tensions in our school, weren't happy. I remember one conversation with Mr. Peterson, the history teacher, who pulled me aside after class. "You're stirring up trouble," he said, his voice low but firm. "You should be careful. People don't like this kind of talk. It makes things uncomfortable." I stood my ground. "Mr. Peterson, uncomfortable doesn't mean wrong. We have to start facing the truth, no matter how hard it is." He didn't say anything else, just shook his head and walked away. I could feel his disapproval, but it didn't matter. I had made up my mind. As the days passed, the school board agreed to hold a town hall, a space where students could come together and discuss the issues we had been raising. I was terrified, but also excited. This was our chance to be heard, to finally say what had been silenced for so long. The night of the town hall, the atmosphere was electric. Students filled the auditorium, the air thick with anticipation. Parents and teachers filled the seats as well, some eager for change, others skeptical, unsure of what to expect. When it was our turn to speak, Jake and I stood side by side. My heart was pounding in my chest, but the words came out steady, clear. We talked about everything: the racial discrimination, the bullying, the systems that kept us silent for so long. We shared the stories of students who had been hurt, ignored, or overlooked. As I spoke, I realized something. This was no longer about Ray or about me or Jake. This was about something far greater. This was about creating a world where every student, no matter their race or background, could walk into that school and feel safe. When I finished speaking, the room was silent for a moment. And then, something remarkable happened. One by one, people started to speak up. Students shared their own experiences. Parents spoke of their fears and hopes for their children. And even some teachers stood up, acknowledging the problems that had long been ignored. It wasn't easy. Some of the words were uncomfortable, and not everyone was on our side. But the truth was out there now, and no one could pretend it didn't exist. The ending, a new beginning. The town hall didn't solve everything. The fight for justice and equality rarely does. But it was the beginning of something, a new chapter, one where we no longer stayed silent, a new chapter where we spoke out for what was right, even when it was difficult. After the town hall, things started to change. The school board agreed to implement new policies, to create more inclusive spaces for students, and to address the concerns we had raised. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't immediate, but it was progress. Jake and I kept pushing forward. We continued to organize discussions, to raise awareness, and to make sure the conversation didn't stop just because the town hall was over. There were challenges, of course, but we were no longer fighting alone. And as for Ray, he graduated the following year. His story didn't end with the way he was treated at school, but with the strength he found within himself. He became an advocate, using his voice to help others who had been silenced. Just like he had been, looking back, I realized that everything we went through, the struggles, the pain, the humiliation, led us to this point. We didn't just change the school. We changed ourselves. We found our voices. And we learned that sometimes it's not the easy path that leads to growth, but the one that challenges us, that pushes us to stand up for what's right. The fight isn't over, but I've learned that the fight for justice, for equality, for dignity, those are the battles that shape us, that make us stronger. And sometimes, the hardest battles bring about the most beautiful change. As I look back at everything we accomplished, I realize that we didn't just make noise. We made a difference. And in the end, that's all that matters. Thank you for watching this powerful story of heartbreak, redemption, and the unexpected twists of life. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to Empathy Stories. Your support helps us continue sharing meaningful stories that touch the heart and inspire change. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. See you next time.